Welcome to Brian Lehrer Live. We're here live Wednesday nights at 7:30. Tonight, the top 3 Al-Qaeda leaders all released taped messages. We'll look at excerpts of each and see what they mean with radical Islam expert Fawaz Gerges. Also tonight, should all convicted criminals in New York have DNA samples taken, no matter how small the crime? We'll get 2 views, and we'll meet the creator of a breast cancer memorial and see some of her work. First to the tapes released by Zarqawi, Zawahiri, and bin Laden. With us as our viewing partner for these is Fawaz Gerges, Middle East Studies professor at Sarah Lawrence College and author most recently of The Journey of the Jihadist Inside Muslim Militancy, published by the Harcourt Press. Professor Gerges, always a pleasure. Welcome back to the program.
It's always my pleasure.
So the first video that we're going to view is an excerpt from the Zarqawi video, which I know you think is very dramatic and has a lot of meaning in the conflict in Iraq as well as globally, and I understand that you have agreed to do some live translation from the Arabic for us.
I would be delighted. And it was the first videotape by Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, the first ever. So really it has some added importance.
He had been a secretive, reclusive figure until then. And all right, let's watch, and then we'll talk about why he's never shown his face until now. And let us watch.
في يوم الجمعة 23 من شهر ربيع الأول لسنة 1427 للهجرة الموافق 21 من شهر نيسان سنة 2006 للميلاد والحمد لله رب العالمين.
He's talking about basically dates. This is a training scene whereby Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, Al-Qaeda leaders in Iraq, walking in the deserts in Iraq, and the Iraq theater is the most pivotal and dangerous theaters in the world. Here you have Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi showing his military might.
Okay, and we will see some of the now famous outtakes from that video in a minute. But first tell us, why has he not shown his face before, and why has he now?
Well, as you know, Brian, many Iraqis and even many Arabs and Muslims doubted the existence of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. In fact, the argument was Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi was a figment of the American imagination. And secondly, Brian, it's for security reasons. If he appears on camera, it increases, the picture increases the risks to his security. And thirdly, I think, as you know, there were so many reports about his demise, his marginalization. There was a great deal of criticism of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi inside Iraq and outside Iraq for his indiscriminate terrorist methods. And many reports said, well, look, he was marginalized, he was out of the picture. Here he comes with the first time with a videotape saying, not only I exist, but I am the field commander of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I can still wage the battle against the American forces in Iraq.
So he engages in some terrorist methods that even other terrorists question?
Well, absolutely. I think what we need to understand is that while resistance against the American occupiers is seen as a legitimate device by many Iraqis and many Arabs and Muslims, his indiscriminate attacks against the Shiites, against, the Jordanians, as you know, he carried out 3 major attacks in Jordan and Amman. I think those attacks were seen as illegitimate and terroristic. And as you know, Brian, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi has been trying to really unleash a sectarian fight between the Shiites, who represent 60% of the population, and the Sunnis. And this, of course, goes against, the sentiments of most Iraqis and Arabs and Muslims.
How would a Sunni-Shiite civil war in Iraq benefit Al-Qaeda?
Well, remember, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi and Al-Qaeda believe that the Shiites serve as collaborators of the Americans. And in the eyes of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, the only way to mobilize a large Sunni public opinion. Remember, he's a Sunni, and he believes that the only way to wage the struggle is to rally Sunni public opinion. So the only way is to basically polarize the struggle along Sunni-Shiite line and create a sectarian war whereby the Al-Qaeda establishes a major base in Iraq. And in one of the segments, he said, Iraq is the most important pivotal theaters for Al-Qaeda. This is really a highly salient point, Brian. Al-Qaeda has emerged as the most important theater for Al-Qaeda.
Does Osama bin Laden believe that? And do the two of them coordinate? Zarqawi has called himself bin Laden's representative in Iraq, but does bin Laden consider him to be that?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, not only he considers Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, Al-Qaeda leaders in Iraq, as his representative, he issued an official statement or fatwa appointing Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi as Al-Qaeda's Amir or Prince in Iraq. But there is one critical difference. Both Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri is Al-Qaeda's #2, basically have criticized Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, Al-Qaeda leaders in Iraq, for basically his attacks, his indiscriminate attacks against the Shiites and their mosques. Because they argued, if you attack the Shiites, you basically create a wave of anti-Al-Qaeda sentiments in the Arab and Muslim world.
And we'll see clips from tapes both by bin Laden and Zawahiri in just a minute. First to these outtakes that the United States government has used to try to mock or ridicule Zarqawi. We're going to show two. The first one has to do with trouble that he supposedly had firing a weapon to demonstrate his power for the original video. The second one will have to do with a pair of sneakers that you'll see him wearing. Let's watch the first one with the gun first, and again, you'll tell us what's going on here.
He's having difficulties trying to use the weapons. He does not now. The weapon jammed. He's saying, what's happening?
And he's got an aide there.
Absolutely. Now he shoots.
Okay.
I mean, what the American military, remember, there is an ideological propaganda war going on. It's not just Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi is trying to really rally Sunni public opinion and his supporters. The American military is trying to make fun, mock Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, and they say, listen, you are the Amir of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. You're supposed to be the insurgent leaders, and yet you cannot really use a weapon. The weapon jammed, you called for one of your supporters to help you. It's part of the public relations campaign.
Right, rhetoric on each
Absolutely.
side. But do you think it worked from the U.S. perspective? I've read that that's actually a pretty difficult weapon to fire. So
Yes.
do you think that people around the Arab world or Muslim-speaking world would have seen him in a negative light from watching that outtake?
Not at all. And just a footnote here, Brian, neither Al Arabiya nor Al Jazeera, the two largest satellite television stations, showed the clip, the outtake by the U.S. military. And remember, he is rallying his supporters. He's not really trying to appeal to the large Arab or Muslim public opinion. So in this particular sense, I would say his supporters take heart. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi is alive, he's combative, he's still fighting the war against the Americans in Iraq.
This is for turnout, not for the swing voters.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the other video outtake that we're going to watch, the key thing to look for here is at the end when he shows his big clunky American sneakers when you think he's going to be wearing some kind of terrorist combat boots. Check this out.
Yeah.
God is great. We have defeated America in Iraq using its own weapons. This is an American weapon, Brian. And yes, he's wearing sneakers. The American military wanted to mock Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi by saying, where's the leader? Where's the insurgent leader? He's wearing, after all, tennis shoes. Is this really it? Is this the man that basically would like to portray himself as the ultimate seasoned, tough leader?
You know, in television, sometimes in the summer on a very hot day, you might have a local TV anchor, say a Chuck Scarborough or somebody like that, come in with a shirt and tie and a suit coat like I'm wearing, but shorts, because it's very
That's
hot,
very true.
and the camera only sees the top. I don't know if Chuck Scarborough has ever done it. Other anchors I know have done it.
Yes.
And so is that the kind of thing? Because he thought he was only going to be shot from the waist up?
But this is really, I think, the American military, I think, misses unfortunately, the big picture. The big picture is not Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi wearing tennis shoes or not. The big picture is that Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi is healthy, he's sturdy, he's alive, and he is fighting. He is a fighter. And this message resonates and the minds of his supporters. Truly, I think that particular videotape raised the profile of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi in the eyes of his supporters, who were extremely nervous. Where were you, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi? Because, as you know, many reports in the Western press basically talked about his demise. For quite many months, we did not hear a single word from Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi.
Okay, let's go on to a little bit of the Osama bin Laden tape. This was actually an audio tape, and we will see him on screen, and we will hear him in Arabic with a BBC translation. This is from the Beeb. Let's watch.
It is an ongoing war against Muslims. The enemy continues to murder our children, our women, the elderly, and destroy our home.
So just a short clip of that, but what is Osama bin Laden up to in this tape?
Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, basically was reiterating his message. This is not about Al-Qaeda, the United States versus Al-Qaeda. This is a war between the United States and the Muslim nation, the Muslim Ummah. This is a war against the Islamic nation, against Muslims. This is really, he wants to polarize, and he's been consistent. This is not just about Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. This is about the West versus Islam. It's a war of cultures. It's a war of religions.
But you know what really struck me elsewhere in that tape? He warned the West against going into Darfur because this would be seen as another Western incursion against Muslims. But Muslims are the victims of genocide in this case. So how does that strike people in the Muslim world if he's trying to dissuade the West from going in on behalf of Muslim genocide victims?
It does not. It does not. But remember, Brian, the message in the Muslim world, this is not an intra-Muslim conflict that's going on in Sudan. Sudan has portrayed the conflict as the West is trying to really occupy Sudan. This is another, you might say, play of the Iraq conflict. But I don't think his message in Darfur resonates with Arabs and Muslims. I have no evidence. I have not seen any evidence to that.
Okay. Let's go right on to look at a tape about the Zawahiri video. We'll see this described, and we'll see his face as part of a Fox News package. Let's watch.
Senior U.S. counterterrorism officials say this tape is newly released, but it is not new. They believe this tape was made sometime in November or December of last year. That they say this based on messages on the tape. Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda's #2 man, makes on this videotape messages, time references, and also an Arabic timestamp that is on the video. Now, as for the message of the tape, officials say it is intended to boost morale and financial support for Al-Qaeda. There are no specific threats to the U.S. or U.S. interests. Now, if, as they believe, this tape was recorded in November or December of 2005, it would precede another tape that came out in late January following the failed attempt to take him out in a village in northwest Pakistan. U.S. officials don't see much significant in the newly released tape. The one thing that is interesting, however, is that Zawahiri praises Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi for his efforts in Iraq. In recent months, there's been a reported rift between senior Al-Qaeda and Zarqawi because of his tactics, the tactics he's been using on the ground in Iraq.
Now, Professor Gerges, of the three, Zarqawi, bin Laden, and Zawahiri, Zawahiri is probably the least well-known to the American public. Who is he?
Actually, Brian, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda #2, he is Osama bin Laden deputies, has become the public face of Al-Qaeda in the last 2 years. He has released about 25 audio and videotapes. In fact, Osama bin Laden, in the last 2 years or so, he released 1 videotape and 1 audio tape. While Ayman Zawahiri, he is really the brains, the nerve center, the conceptualizer of Al-Qaeda, the most important public face of Al-Qaeda today. And in the tape, actually, in the videotape, what Ayman Zawahiri said, he said, we have broken America's back in Iraq. America is losing in Iraq. And one final point about, the Al-Qaeda new media blitz, really the main fundamental focus was on Iraq. Because I think, Brian, what's happening in Iraq in the last few weeks is some political momentum. Even though Iraq remains deeply polarized, there is some tentative political progress. And the 3 tapes, Ayman Zawahiri, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, and Osama bin Laden, tried to rally Sunni public opinion and warn Iraqi Sunnis against really buying into the political game. Because as I suggested earlier, Brian, Iraq has emerged as the most pivotal theater for Al-Qaeda.
And notably, Zawahiri praised Zarqawi in that tape, praised the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq when there was reported to be some kind of rift between them in the past. Is that a public statement to try to heal something or try to make a public point?
Absolutely. You asked me earlier about why there was so much criticism of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. Al-Zarqawi is Al-Qaeda's emir in Iraq. Because of his terroristic methods, because of his targeting of Shiites and Arab civilians. And here you have Ayman Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda's #2, coming out and saying, I support our emir in Iraq. You're doing a marvelous job. You're winning the war. You have broken America's back in Iraq again. It tells you how important Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi has become to Al-Qaeda.
So there is some progress in Iraq toward forming a government now. They have this new prime minister, and it's not all done, but it looks like there might be a government that Sunnis and Shiites alike, as well as some other groups, accept. Would that be extremely threatening to the interests of Al-Qaeda?
Absolutely, and I think the reason why the three leaders have synchronized their messages is that because they're anxious about the political momentum. 2 footnotes, Brian. Remember, Al-Qaeda foreign fighters in Iraq represent about 5% of the resistance in Iraq, 5%. So even if Al-Qaeda is eliminated, the insurgency, the resistance continues. And secondly, and this is a very important point, the sectarian divide in Iraq, that is the divide between the Sunnis and the Shiites, has become much more lethal and dangerous than the insurgency itself, than Al-Qaeda. So let's not really exaggerate the significance of Al-Qaeda's role in Iraq, even though Al-Qaeda is very deadly and very lethal in Iraq.
But you wrote something in a piece you have coming out in a Yale University publication that I've not seen elsewhere, that Sunni insurgents have begun to turn on Al-Qaeda insurgents in Iraq. Are they actually launching attacks against each other now?
Absolutely. In fact, there is a, you might say, mini civil war taking place between some Sunni tribes and Al-Qaeda. And Sunni tribes in some areas in Iraq have killed scores of Al-Qaeda and chased others away. So there is, and this you cannot really understand, why Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi has been hiding for quite a while, except by understanding the new rift between some Sunni tribes and Al-Qaeda. So this is why I think you cannot understand Al-Qaeda's anxiety except by understanding the tentative political momentum and the disappointment and disillusionment of the Sunni Arabs in Iraq of Al-Qaeda.
Does Al-Qaeda need Iraq as kind of a training ground, the way it used to use the way it used to use Afghanistan before 9/11?
Absolutely, it needs a base. Afghanistan is no longer. Al-Qaeda now, Osama bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri, are hibernating deeper and deeper underground. Not only they need a base, a physical base, Al-Qaeda supplies them with ideological ammunition. Al-Qaeda supplies them with new recruits. Here you have the United States of America occupying an Arab country in the heart of the Muslim world, and this is the message of Osama bin Laden. America is attacking Islam and Muslims. America is launching a war against the Islamic nation, the Ummah.
Yeah, so you're saying they need Iraq.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, I would say it's more important than Afghanistan, because Iraq is a significant Muslim country in the heart of the world of Islam.
In your book, you say Al-Qaeda is in a minority among jihadists, that most groups favor peaceful political change. Who are those jihadist groups, and what do they want?
Well, as you know, I mean, there are 2 types of jihadis. You have local jihadis, who basically represent the overwhelming number, 95% of jihadis, who would like to focus the war on the home front, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Algeria. And those basically are no longer really using violence to topple the secular pro-Western regime. And you have international jihadis, like Al-Qaeda, who would like to really target both the near enemy, local Arab and Muslim leaders, and the far enemy. And now what we're really hearing is international jihadis who are making the news. We are focusing today on this tiny segment within the jihadist movement. A tiny, but very lethal, very dangerous indeed.
Also in your book, Journey of the Jihadists, you cite Egypt as the birthplace of the modern jihad movement, not Saudi Arabia. Was it Egypt?
Absolutely. The jihadist movement, Brian, was born in Egypt. The first jihadist cell was born in 1966 in Egypt. In fact, all the rank and file of the jihadists are Egyptian. Ayman Zawahiri, he's an Egyptian. The brains and the nerve center of Al-Qaeda are Egyptians, even though you might say the foot soldiers are Saudis and Yemenis, but Egypt is really very fundamental, has been, to the jihadist movement.
You are one of the best-known analysts of political Islam in the United States at this point, but you reveal in the book that you grew up Christian in Lebanon. Do you think that particular background gives you a particular perspective on the current Muslim jihadist movement?
Well, I mean, I hope so. I mean, that's my contention. I think not only because I was born in Lebanon and as a Christian, I think Lebanon, Brian, really was, you might say, an idea of coexistence where Muslims, Jews and Christians coexisted for many years. And in 1975, there was a bloody war in Lebanon where it lasted till 1990. 100,000 people were killed. And my argument in the book is that the fall of the center of Lebanon, the fall of the idea of coexistence in Lebanon between Muslims, Christians and Jews really, you might say, brought about the entire political disintegration of the Arab and Muslim world. The idea, the idea of an open society basically was dismantled in the 1970s and 80s in Lebanon, unfortunately.
Yesterday on my radio show on WNYC, I interviewed the former CIA analyst Michael Scheuer, who used to be the bin Laden bureau chief for the CIA. And he said, you know, maybe on some level, on some abstract level, the jihadists want to establish Muslim rule all over the world, but really, more importantly, they have policy grievances with the United States over U.S. Positions on Israel, over U.S. support for dictators around the Arab world so they can get the oil, things like that. And it's really much more about policy than it is about religion. How much do you agree with that?
Well, I agree. I think this is not really a religious clash, as Osama bin Laden would like us to believe. Remember, the idea, the ideological idea that is an existential civilizational clash is meant for Arab and Muslim eyes, but really at the heart of the conflict lies a political struggle for the heart and soul of Islam and the Muslim world. In fact, I would go further, Brian, and argue that even on 9/11, even on September 11, the United States was not the direct target. The United States, the far enemy, was not the direct target. The direct target was the near enemy. That is, Arab and Muslim governments. Remember, Osama bin Laden had grievances against Saudi Arabia. He wanted to topple the pro-American order in Saudi Arabia and establish a more authentic Islamic state, even though, as you know, Saudi Arabia prides itself on being the most fundamental state in the Muslim world.
And with a little help from the United States invading Iraq, it kind of is working?
Truly, by the way, and again, thank you for your question. Al-Qaeda was in a coma in 2002, 2003. In fact, I argue in the book, I show that the American-led invasion was a God-sent event. It revived Al-Qaeda. It gave it a new lease on life.
Thank you very much for coming in. Very illuminating. Coming up next, should all convicted criminals in New York have DNA samples taken, no matter how small the crime? This is Brian Lehrer Live.
There is really only one boy. One girl. One tree. One forest. One deep, dancing ocean. One mountain calling, one handful of sand through our fingers, one endless sky overhead, and one simple way to care for it all. Please visit earthshare.org and learn how the world's leading environmental groups are working together under one name, EarthShare, one environment, one simple way to care for it.
This is Brian Lehrer Live. We're here live Wednesday nights at 7:30. Now to the question, should all convicted criminals in New York have DNA samples taken, no matter how small the crime? Governor Pataki and Mayor Bloomberg have proposed implementing such a policy, but some New Yorkers think it's too high a price to pay for people who commit small crimes and for taxpayers. Why? We will ask Gerlald Turetsky of the advocacy group called the Respect for Law Alliance, and Bob Perry, Legislative Director of the New York Civil Liberties Union. Welcome both of you to the program. Thank you for coming in. Mr. Turetsky, you support this idea, so tell us why and what it would accomplish.
Well, basically, experts really recognize and have for some time that DNA, when used for identification purposes, is really the 21st century fingerprint. It's at least as accurate, really more so in most cases, and it gives an opportunity when no fingerprints appear to provide an instant identification of a criminal perpetrator, especially in violent and dangerous criminal activity where DNA is most likely to be found, and that's in most cases, as of now, in rapes and in murders.
So play this out for me. If I'm a 17-year-old who steals an apple out of a bodega and I get convicted or plead guilty to a misdemeanor, they're going to take my DNA, and what does that accomplish?
Well, for one thing, like a fingerprint that's in the fingerprint data bank in Albany, the DNA profile, which will be in the DNA index in Albany as well, would provide an opportunity to determine if this person is arrested again, whether or not in the interim between his release and rearrest, he's committed a dangerous, in most cases, a dangerous crime. Now, why do we say this? Right now, in almost every case where a criminal leaves a fingerprint behind at the scene of a crime, he's instantly identified within hours because his DNA, his fingerprint goes up to Albany, and you get an identification with his name as well as his fingerprint, so you know who the perpetrator is. Contrary, on the other hand, when you have DNA left at a crime scene, and most of them are in rape kits, and occasionally in murders as well, in rape murders, pedophile cases very frequently, what you have is non-identification in almost every case. Why? Because the DNA index only has 10% of the criminal population. The fingerprint index, the data bank, has almost 100% of the criminal population.
So, Mr. Perry, if DNA is kind of the fingerprints of the 21st century, why not move to universal DNA sampling when someone is convicted of a crime?
Well, I think there are a number of questions about the analogy, but let me start off by acknowledging that DNA is an important criminal justice law enforcement tool. It can exonerate innocent persons. It can help convict criminals. The problem we've got, and the concern that we're hearing from jurisdictions around the country, is that when you expand the databases sort of exponentially to include low-level offenders, misdemeanants, low-level felons, you actually overwhelm the criminal justice system. As a matter of fact, and again, these reports are coming from law enforcement officials in jurisdictions around the country, that they're less likely to be able to make the DNA connection because they're overwhelmed with samples. To give you one example, out of Oakland, California, there have been reports just this past week of these DNA cold hits that were backlogged for up to 3 years, samples of 3 years in duration.
Of criminals like this whose samples were taken?
These are samples that are taken from a scene, an unknown perpetrator linked to a sample in the state database.
Okay.
Now, in the case, an example that was raised in Oakland, this was a rape investigation. And the reports suggest that the sample was actually in the DNA database. But because the cold hits included low-level sex offenders, low-level felons, it took 3 years to actually get to this DNA sample. What the law enforcement officials suggest is as a result of overwhelming the system with samples that do not correlate to the types of violent crimes that we're seeking to identify and prosecute, we're undermining the effectiveness of law enforcement to do its job.
So let me see if I understand your argument. You're just saying that it might be such a voluminous amount of evidence to catalog and keep track of that law enforcement officials would have to spend so much time going through it in many cases that it would distract them from doing more important things?
More effective law enforcement, in fact. I mean, we hear this term called sort of tunnel vision. When a DNA sample is found at a scene, it becomes the preoccupation of the investigation. Good, tried and tested methods of police work sort of are abandoned for this search for the DNA, and when you've expanded the database to include these low-level offenses, you can create dead ends.
We can take some phone calls from you and our viewing audience tonight about this. Do you think it's a good idea? Do you feel threatened by it on behalf of yourself or any relatives or loved ones of yours? Maybe you work in law enforcement and want to weigh in one way or the other. Anyone may call 212-251-0801. You see it on your screen, 212-251-0801. Mr. Turetsky, what about that particular concern, that it actually makes law enforcement more inefficient because DNA is so much more difficult to work with than fingerprints, and it takes so much time to go through this backlog of what he called cold cases?
Well, as a matter of fact, most jurisdictions, including a few that I'll give you examples of in particular, have found just the opposite when dealing with the level of experience. Firstly, I'll start with the British. In England, there are no restrictions. They take a DNA sample with every fingerprint. They don't wait for a conviction. And as a result, their database has over 2 million DNA profiles. And they get 5,000 hits or matches with DNA found at crime scenes every month. Now, we've had a DNA data bank in this state for about 12 years, and it's been very, very active in the level of activity for at least 7 or 8 years. And every 2 weeks in Great Britain, they get as many matches as we've gotten since the beginning of our program 12 years ago.
And this kind of Oakland scenario that Mr. Perry was describing, that doesn't ever happen in the UK?
Let me tell you, no, it doesn't. And it doesn't happen in the United States, in those jurisdictions that have expanded their DNA data banks. Let me give you a few examples. In Virginia, where they do misdemeanor cases, we have very few misdemeanor cases. They were only added with the help and urging of our own organization 2 years ago, I might add, where they included sex offense misdemeanors, which involve principally pedophiles. And what happens is they found in Virginia that 81% of their matches with DNA found at crime scenes, usually and almost entirely violent crimes, again, rapes, predominantly murders as well, 81% of those matches were with DNA taken from offenders convicted of non-violent offenses, most of them misdemeanors. Now, in New York, 85% of all the sexual offenses where they found the match, this is in New York State now, were with offenders who gave their DNA for non-sexual cases.
Because people who commit serious crimes often have committed less serious crimes in the past. But Mr. Perry, let me ask you, you're representing the New York Civil Liberties Union. You made a law enforcement efficiency argument a minute ago, but what about a civil liberties argument? Is there one?
There is one. The argument is this. William C. Thompson, who's an academic at UC Irvine, has actually been looking at the incidence of abuse and error. I'm talking about negligence as well as intentional abuse and fraud. And he did an analysis of the Houston Crime Lab. It was his investigation that uncovered, gross abuse. And he's looked at about a half a dozen others around the country, and he just documented them in a recent article. The problem here is you've got labs working with huge numbers of samples, with technicians who are not properly credentialed, under enormous pressure to process huge numbers of cases. So the incidence of error, abuse, is now implicating fundamental liberties, which is...
Now, this is a new concept probably to a lot of the viewers, because we usually hear about DNA evidence in the media as being foolproof and more frequently as exonerating the innocent who've been wrongly imprisoned than the other way around.
That's the problem. There's a notion, almost a talismanic notion, of the gold standard of forensic science. And this, again, is not to say it does not have its value. It clearly is a powerful law enforcement tool, but so powerful that without the checks and regulations over the quality of the samples that are being collected, the way they are analyzed, the way they are reported, the person's human error enters into every step of the process, the collection, the analysis, and the reporting. And our concern is in New York State we haven't even begun to examine those questions.
Are there any examples of false convictions based on DNA evidence?
Well, there are many, and William Thompson in this recent article has documented them. One in Texas, a man wrongly prosecuted of a rape ended up spending 5 years in prison before it was discovered that there was an error in the collection of the sample, a misrepresentation of the evidence at trial, and it was William C. Thompson's study that got the man exonerated.
What about that problem?
Well, I'm happy to report that that's inapplicable in New York State. As a matter of fact, New York has the most advanced infrastructure, the training and the processing, the development, and the reporting systems for DNA use are more advanced in New York State probably than any other state in the United States. The reason being that in 2001 we had that urgent need to identify people, the remains of people, with microscopic samples of DNA. And as a result, we developed and spent millions and millions of dollars developing that infrastructure. And in addition, we took advantage between 2001 and 2003 of federal funding and spent millions of dollars not only developing the infrastructure for DNA sampling, but also the entire process. And as a result, we don't have the backlogs that Bob was just referring to.
May I rebut?
Yes, briefly.
Actually, there was a recent news story. The governor recently issued an executive order directing the collection of DNA from persons who were required to produce it as a condition of parole. There are reports from local crime labs saying we are overwhelmed. We haven't got the resources to collect, process, and analyze these samples as a result of the governor's executive order. So we've got a lot of work to do before we think about the implications.
And let's talk about the cost and the resources, and you mentioned the finances. Louisiana passed a very sweeping law, something like, I guess you're advocating, the governor and mayor are advocating for New York, and they haven't been able to implement it because it's just so expensive. So is it worth that much taxpayer dollar? And is it worth that much of the taxpayer's dollar being diverted from other potential law enforcement uses?
Let me answer that in two ways. The costs have come way down, especially where we have the advanced structure for DNA sampling and analysis that we have in New York. We've eliminated the backlog. We had a backlog of 17,000 rape kits as of 2001 and 2002. We spent those millions of dollars, and now there is no backlog. And since that time, we've accumulated an additional 1,000 or more, actually several thousand more rape kits. And yet the entire mix of those rapists and murderers now totals close to 15,000. So we're really not making a dent. We actually literally have an army of violent offenders. The most dangerous and violent hardcore offenders in the entire state are in this group. And they're shielded from DNA identity because they're arrested regularly. And yet we don't take the DNA of most of them because 90% are excluded under existing restrictions. As a result, they're still out there, even though they're arrested regularly. Some of the times they're prosecuted. They will plea bargain, as most cases are, down to non-designated crimes, felonies, non-designated, misdemeanors, non-designated, and so they'll serve a short sentence and then get out again and not be charged for rapes and murders.
You want to rebut that? It makes it sound like there would be a lot more success actually prosecuting the most serious crimes committed in New York State.
Under this expansion?
Yes.
Well, I'd like to go back to the sort of the liberty interest question in response to your question. Harlan Levy, a former ADA, Assistant District Attorney in Manhattan, wrote a piece recently in which he said, there are three questions I have. There's a question as to lab technicians making errors. There's a question as to police, a rival, an angry spouse, planting DNA evidence at a scene. There's the problem of innocent people being at a scene, a sample is picked up, now they are implicated as a suspect. These are real phenomena. The William C. Thompson study suggested that there is actually not only negligence, error, but intentional fraud. And when you expand the database exponentially, as we're proposing here, you increase the possibility not only of negligence and error, but intentional fraud. There was a case back in the late 80s where state police were involved in planting fingerprints.
So how do you balance these two concerns? I mean, a police officer or a civilian could plant evidence in other ways against somebody who they were out to get. On the other hand, we have what Mr. Turetsky just described about that backlog of unsolved cases. And Police Commissioner Kelly was saying the other day that DNA evidence was crucial in the investigation of Imet Sanguillen, the student at John Jay College who was found raped and murdered earlier this year. How do you balance that kind of thing against the potential civil liberties concern and come up with don't do it?
Well, I would go back to the proposition I opened up with the first, and I doubt Mr. Turetsky would argue with this, that we may have resources now, we may have funding now, but given the proposal to expand, you're talking about tens of thousands of additional samples. It seems to me there ought to be some deliberation, some weighing of the evidence regarding the implications of this type of expansion. We're in an election year. The governor and the mayor stood on the steps of City Hall saying this needs to be done. The governor's looking to make his entrance onto the national stage. Let's step back a bit from the politics and examine the implications of this proposal.
Let's take a phone call. Kevin in Chelsea, thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Hi, how are you, Brian?
How are you doing? Thank you.
Well, personally, I've had a friend who, now about years ago, very violently raped, almost killed, and a lot of us were hoping that, someday down the road, there was a DNA sample obtained from that experience. Maybe someday they'll catch the guy, and it hasn't happened yet. So I understand the argument for obtaining and indexing DNA samples. On the other hand, I would ask Mr. Turetsky, what about just sampling everyone? You're born, or if you immigrate to the U.S., every human being in the U.S., index their DNA. So you don't even just get the people who may have stolen an apple. You actually get everyone. So
would that be the ultimate, and Kevin, thank you for your call on a provocative question, would that be the ultimate database, in your opinion?
I don't really see a problem with it. Millions of people are now DNA'd. For example, everybody in the armed forces is DNA'd for obvious reasons, in order to identify them in case they serve abroad, and DNA identification is necessary. But we really shouldn't be discussing that in terms of the criminal justice problem. We are talking about thousands of victims, thousands, not hundreds, not dozens, but every single year. Thousands, mostly women and children, are most innocent and defenseless, are victimized by perpetrators of what is easily preventable crimes.
But, Mr. Perry, very briefly, would the caller's suggestion be the ultimate intrusive government nightmare as far as you're concerned?
I think it would. These are criminal indexes. By virtue of being placed in this, your sample, wherever it may turn up, if it's in a crime scene, makes you a suspect by definition. That's the concern.
There's a compromise that I wonder if either of you would endorse, or maybe both of you would endorse, and we can solve it all right here tonight, and that is to only take DNA samples from all felons, but not people who commit just misdemeanors. Would you go for that?
What we've done is looked at the legislative history and the legislative intent that the legislature established when they adopted the DNA database. And they were quite explicit about suggesting that the purpose of this and the most effective use is to take samples from those types of crimes where there are semen or blood samples that would correlate to future recidivist violent offenses. I think that seems rational.
My understanding is 43 states already take samples from convicted felons. What do you think about that idea?
It would be an improvement from where we are now, but it's not sufficient. And let me tell you why. It would exclude 4 out of 5 violent offenders. 4 out of 5 would not be picked up when they're arrested, because that was Virginia's experience. 81% of all their matches were with DNA taken after mostly misdemeanor convictions, but all non-violent convictions, that 81% we're talking about. Correlated here in New York with 85% of all sex offenders were matched in the DNA profile for samples taken for non-sexual criminal violations. What we need is the maximum expansion as quickly as possible, so we make the DNA data bank the powerful tool that it can be. Right now it has 10% of the criminal population. It really should have 60, 70, 80% in order to be that maximum effective tool.
We just have a minute left. Let me ask one political question and get an answer from both of you. Governor Pataki has been for this for years and years and years, and suddenly it's all over the media. I don't think it's just because Mayor Bloomberg has come out for it. Are Democrats suddenly getting behind this in Albany, or is Eliot Spitzer in favor of this?
I've had discussions with Joe Lenthal, who's the chairman of the Codes Committee, from which this has to emanate, the DNA bill.
From the Assembly?
Yes. And this is where it's been locked up for the past number of years. And they indicate that they are amenable now to considering a significant expansion. I think they may even be seriously considering all misdemeanors and all felonies. And we're pushing them even beyond that to all convicted criminals.
That's the Democratic-controlled Assembly. So is there a political sea change taking place right now?
I think you're seeing an election year phenomenon. There's not been a single hearing on this issue. The governor has made it a big issue. The mayor clearly has. In an election year, I think politicians will be defensive.
To your knowledge, has Elliot Spitzer taken a position?
I don't know if he has.
Okay.
There have been extensive hearings by the State Investigation Commission to which I testified,
obviously
looking into all the issues.
Not the last we're going to hear about this. Thank you both very much. Coming up next, we'll meet a sculptor who has created an evolving work of art dedicated to women with breast cancer. She calls it a memorial. This is Brian Lehrer Live.
Some of New York's most admired figures don't sell out concerts. There'll never be a running back for the Giants. And they probably won't go platinum. But to millions of kids, their teachers are still the biggest heroes in the world. Join New York's brightest. Teach NYC.
Prominent professors, outstanding students, illustrious alumni, all on the Emmy-nominated magazine show about CUNY. Hi, I'm Dwayne Ferguson. Join us this Sunday when we'll bring you the stories about people and programs that make CUNY a place where you study with the best.
This is Brian Lehrer Live. We're here live Wednesday nights at 7:30. You can also see this program live on the web or view any past programs at CUNY.TV. We also have links to all the video clips we use on the show. That's at CUNY.TV. Next, we will meet sculptor Mary Ellen Scherl, becoming known as the creator of a work of art called a memorial. That's memorial, as in mammary or breast. It is art created out of the experience that women have with breast cancer. We'll see some of the work and talk about what it means and why it's getting so much attention. Mary Ellen, welcome to the program. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Why don't we start right off by showing a slide of some of your work, and you'll describe it to our viewers. So let's put this up. What are we looking at?
We are looking at a collection of life casts of cancer-affected breasts, cast at every stage of detection, from the moment of detection, after surgery, after mastectomy, after reconstruction. And it also, these images also represent the full spectrum of the disease, but along with these images, the women who are participating write about their experience. So it's not only about the physical experience, it's about the spectrum of the emotional experience too.
When you say a life cast, what do you mean by that?
Well, this is an example of a life cast. This is a mastectomy, a life cast, and it's created with these materials. This begins as a liquid, and it is painted onto the chest, and it cures rather quickly, and as soon as it's cured, there's a shell that's created out of plaster, plaster gauze stripping that is put on top of it because this is flexible, and I wouldn't be able to create the harder life cast without the mother mold that's holding this rubber cast.
So let's take a look at that one. This is a final product?
Yes, this is a final product, as is this.
Okay, can we look at this one again?
Sure.
You said this is a mastectomy. A mastectomy is an act of surgery. So explain what you mean by this is a mastectomy.
This is an example of a woman who has had a mastectomy. And each of these casts has a name or a phrase that's engraved on it and so that the woman can identify herself in the exhibition. So this is exactly what her body looks like, because this alginate is almost like a dental impression. It's so accurate. You can see the texture of her skin, the shape of her scar. And this is also a life cast. In this case,
hold it up to the camera, facing
sure.
that way.
When my initial outreach was through family and friends. I sent an email out to everybody who I knew and told them about this idea. And this woman told me my timing was uncanny. She had just discovered that she had the BRCA gene. And she thought it would be cathartic and important for her to participate in Memorial. And
even though she had not had any treatment or anything like that. And the BRCA gene is?
The BRCA gene is a genetic indication of carrying the breast cancer gene.
Of a high risk for breast cancer.
Yes. In her case, she had an 87% chance of developing breast cancer. So this is a mold of her body before she decided to go through prophylactic mastectomy.
So what's the point of doing this art? Does it help the women who participate? Does it do something more globally for fighting the disease? Why do this as art?
All of the above. My art has always been about a woman's feelings toward her body. And this is, it actually began with a series of pieces based on an obese model. And it evolved into the trauma that breast cancer survivors.
Talk about that evolution. I know you worked for, what, a number of years with a 400-pound model?
I did. Well, she was nearly 400 pounds. She wasn't quite 400 pounds. And I created a series of sculptures with her. And that work was recognized and invited into shows, art shows. And one of the shows was focused on the breast. And among the artists in this show, I noticed that those who submitted breast artwork often focused on breast cancer. And then I was invited to another show with for the same piece of sculpture, and that show was benefiting cancer foundations. And I identified this trend of somehow art and healing and breast cancer, and I thought maybe there was a way I could somehow help fight breast cancer through my art. And I had the
Let's see a few more examples. Let's go to another slide. What are we seeing here?
Again, this is another double mastectomy.
Okay. And so I guess we got a pretty good idea of what that was from the one you had on the set, but it's not an image we see every day, certainly, right?
No,
Unless
it's
you've been
not.
through it personally.
It's not. I mean, it seems that there's a lot of healing that goes on when the women come and visit the exhibition and learn about others' experiences, and they can share it with their family and friends and get through the pain of it a little bit.
Let's show another slide and tell us what we're seeing here.
This is a slide that was actually prepared for an upcoming retreat that I'm attending this weekend in Tampa. There are 85 African American women who are going on a cancer retreat, 80% of whom have had breast cancer. And I was asked to bring my mold-making materials, and if anyone is interested, they are welcome to participate.
I understand that you yourself have not had breast cancer.
True.
So why have you decided to devote so much of your work to this?
When I came up with the idea, I felt like the median for the idea that it was bigger than me, and I felt it was my obligation to do this once I had that idea.
Has this been a transforming experience for you as an artist, as a person?
Of course. All the people that I've met and entered into their lives, and it's indescribable, really.
We have one more example of work from the memorial.
Yeah.
What are we looking at here?
This is another life cast near and dear to my heart because it's my sister-in-law's. And she actually was instrumental in giving me the confidence to go forward with this idea. I didn't know, once I had the idea, if anyone would want to participate. And she said, "Are you kidding? Women want a voice." And I must also say that men want a voice, too. This is a problem for men as well, especially when they're considering, when it's a woman's disease, they feel the shame of having it, too. But she said it's very important.
Because it's not common in men, but it does occur in some men.
It does occur, yes. Yeah. And men are contacting me to participate, which is fantastic.
Right. So are any of these casts of men with breast cancer?
In the pipeline. Since the story has been in the news, I have a few men from different regions of the country contact me wanting to participate, and that is so fantastic.
You've compared the memorial to the legendary AIDS quilt, where people can add a square on behalf of one person with AIDS. Talk about the comparison.
Well, this is an ongoing project, and it's a comparison because there's the continuous possibility of new art emerging from the project. It's healing for those who participate. I wish I had time to read you some samples of some of the writings. They're just magnificent.
Can you paraphrase one?
Well, one woman wrote to me, actually this woman wrote to me saying that before she made this cast, she and her husband, she had made a plaster cast of her breast, and she and her husband went to a cliff and tossed the cast out into the ocean. And just as she was going to be losing her breast through surgery, and then the rains came pouring down on them, and she entitled her breast the terrain of trauma, but it is, as she says, it speaks to the courage and love of life that keeps me whole.
And there's courage and love of life in this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for tonight's show. We're here live Wednesday nights at 7:30 in May and June. Next week, we'll continue our series with newsworthy and viral video from the web. And don't forget to check out my daily radio show, weekday mornings at 10 on WNYC, New York Public Radio. Tomorrow morning, can the Democrats win back control of Congress? That's on 93.9 FM and 8:20 AM tomorrow morning at 10. Have a great night.